to see you, Professor. So, we want to talk about NAGPRA, right? And that's kind of where we're at and what we're going to be dealing with. And I got to tell you, I'm going to be framing an article around NAGPRA and arguing for Native hip hop uh, uh, as being a component and an aspect that needs to be included within this side of NAGPRA for the Native Graves Repatriation Act, Native American, yeah, NAGPRA, Graves and Repatriation Act, because well, it's important, right? I mean, I'm into hip hop and I'm into Native hip hop, obviously. So I just kind of I see that there's an actual connection there that has not been explored or discussed, and I'm sure once I finish with the submission, it's going to be rejected because people just won't understand it. But be that as it may, this article is really going to help because it's going to give me some leverage and some resources that I've been looking for and needing. And I called up that submission early on already. So thank you for that, and thank you for pushing me in that direction to make sure that I actually get it off my desk. Once I finish up with all the other stuff that we have to get going. So NAGPRA, Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And the article is really nice because it centers around one specific area, Missouri, the University of Missouri, and it talks about and really kind of gives the background, the association of it. But what I really like about this article, just to kind of help you get some groundwork on it, is that it comes from a student activist position, and that's an important point and distinction to make. That it's really kind of capitalizing on that energy and that importance, rather than it just being something from the outside community that is then gotten a wind or a tip that something's happening on a university campus, and then there's a big hullabaloo and problems and complications between the external and the internal, which is often the case. We see that more often than not. And so I like the fact that this one's coming from from an insider perspective, if you want to look at it, because there is a couple of ways. Well, there's yeah, there's at least two ways to be looking at this, which doesn't get talked about with NAGPRA, is that there is an inside outsider perspective and binary that's in play. The insider meaning that it's the tribe and the tribal understanding and their relationship to the burial rites and ceremonial practices that are involved, that are related to cultures, customs, knowledge, traditions, social political expressions, social religious, spirituality, philosophy, and environmental issues, and all those activists and all those agencies rather, and elements are employed with inside of it. So NACPRA is not just a singular momentum or legal apparatus. I mean, it has all of these things that are invested. So an insider perspective is really coming from the tribal perspective. The outsider is the people that are fighting against it. And so what we see then in the media, this is the fun part. When you look at it from an external, non-native perspective of the media, what you get most often is you get an outsider's perspective viewing the insider as being negative against what's happening. So native people, by and large, and I'm going to talk and tease this one out, okay, so bear with me. Oftentimes when it's taken an outsider perspective looking at the insider, what you're seeing then is that the native tribes are contesting and pushing against the progression of contemporary society, that the tribes are so invested and immersed in an ancestral way of living, an arcane perspective and situation of identity, that there's no credibility or relationship to a contemporary history or location. And so in doing that, and this is by and large an external non-native perspective, okay, and when you look at it from a media angle that way, and if you're looking for resources, that's a place to go. You would do just a real kind of a quick, general search and see, like, well, what is it that, that the media says about, about Native American Graves Repatriation Act? What do they say? And you'll see a ton of broadcasts and things are coming up. Am I telling you my research project? Yeah. This is like the angle, right? So, but when you look at it from an insider, when you look at it from a native news perspective, then what happens is you get the other side of it. You get the tribe saying that by and large the non-native, American communities just do not understand tribal rights, self-determination, and sovereignty. They just don't understand it, and this begats a larger question, which is the complex one. All right. And I was talking about this earlier today, is that the the grounding point and the thing that makes talking about native issues so complicated is that native people have the preponderance of evidence that they have to prove historically first before they can make their argument. Native people literally have to go through an educational process to explain what is happening and what has been going on inside of tribal, customs, cultures, traditions, knowledge, social, social, political, environmental, social, religious, spiritual, and philosophical agencies since the tribe, had its contact in colonial, points and moments all the way up to the current time. So because of that necessity to educate the non-native, slash American communities, it weighs down the argument, because who wants to sit around and listen to, 500 plus years, 525 years of colonial history from one singular tribe over the fact that you're saying, like, that these remains, and or artifacts, funeral objects, or or even just, artistic, elements that are housed inside a museum that are miscalculated, mislabeled, that the tribe needs to have accurately, repatriated them, given back, and or assigned with the proper, designation. Who wants to hear all that history just to get to that point in argument? So it defeats the purpose, right? And then that's one. The second element is that you tell me how many times you actually hear about a native identity and or representation in the mainstream media. I'll wait. Go ahead. You see what I mean? Did it's when was the last time you heard about it? Now we're in the month of November, obviously, which is a left-handed compliment because this is quote unquote Native American Heritage Month, which I see as, a bastardization, towards Native people, because it's coinciding, with, I'm going to say the T word, with Thanksgiving, which is, in and of itself, a racialized institutional practice, because it's celebrating colonialism, against Native people. Where the tribes came to resuscitate and, and help the failing colonies, in which, in effect, the thanks that they gave was by territorializing, taking over, and colonizing, their land and territory, and later on forcibly removing the tribes off of their land and territories, falsifying, records and data for land, land claims, and this is why the program Land Back is so important. There's another resource for you. Just look up and do a quick Google and YouTube search on Land Back. Those programs, those podcasts are like awesome, and it talks about all this stuff, right? So you're going to probably hear somewhat of an association or relationship during this time and this month, because of this left-handed, skewed, racist, institutionalized, celebration that is placed upon Native people, because it's celebrating genocide. That's what it is. It's celebrating the genocide of tribal, entities inside of North America. So I always have a problem with it. I always have a problem with the month of November. That's why for me it's Native American Hip Hop Month. It's Native Hip Hop Month. It's not not Native American Heritage Month, because every month is Native American Heritage Month. Every moment of it is, because you can't live in America's society without living in Native American society. You can't. The fact that we don't discuss it along that lines shows then again the importance of NAGPRA, not as a legal institution, but as an ideological practice that needs to be done. Native American Graves Repatriation Act is actually, with the way that I see it, and I'm framing it for you in this argument, is that it's not just a localized, situated, contextual legal apparatus. Rather, it is an ideological principle and property that needs to be ascertained and exercised on the larger scope and level of culture for American populous society. That's the way I see it. And in doing so, you're taking the core components of what NAGPRA is, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, and saying that there's a repatriation that needs to happen for Native peoples and their funeral objects and their artifacts, as well as their artistic elements that have been removed, and mislabeled, misunderstood, inappropriately housed, inaccurately cared for, that needs to be repatriated back. So, what am I arguing then? The larger discourse of it is that its native identity and native representation needs to have a NAGPRA ideology framed and contextualized in American cultural society. That's what I'm saying. But that's a paradigm shift, because what it's saying is that, oh, you mean that the larger populace and federal government all of a sudden needs to give credibility and access and representation and witnessing and recognizing, native tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Yeah, that's NAGPRA. Yeah, that's where it comes from. That's the spirit of that law. It's just being exercised and implemented not as a mechanical motion legally, but actually then as a mechanism for the rights of self-determination and sovereignty of Native people. It decolonizes the colonialist doctrine and mandates that America as superimpose hegemonically on top of Native American communities. That's what I'm saying. And this article is like perfect because it's coming out of the spirit of the youth, which, was also the catalyst that launched, the Alcatraz movement, which is the catalyst that launched the longest walk, which is the catalyst that brought attention to, the incident in Oglala, which later, 50 plus years later, there's finally Leonard Peltier, the man who, fell victim to it, was released, right? I mean, what, like 2, 3 months now? Down the road, finally, after being wrongly, incarcerated for 50 plus years, with a 53, 55 years, something like that. I mean, come on. There is an invested, there is an invested necessity for this to happen, because it's the possessiveness of the invested possessiveness of native entities inside of the United States needs to have fair, equitable, and representation along the lines of self-determination and sovereignty. Now, the problem with sovereignty is the fact that tribes never used that term. Tribes practiced sovereignty. Tribes practiced self-determination, but they also did so in recognition and witness of the surrounding tribes because of the trade embargoes and the relationship that they had, the networks of survival. They never used the word sovereignty. Sovereignty it was implanted, it comes out of the discourse of it's a colonial discourse tool, is what it really is, because it was brought over from Europe, saying that, oh, we are a sovereign nation, so we, have the right to practice, our laws, legalities, language, calendar, and cultural, ethics, inside of these territorial bounds. So for tribes to then be coined, as sovereign and to fight for the rights of sovereignty, what they're doing is they're taking the language of the colonizer, they're usurping it, and then representing it through a native identity and lens. So the fact that I use it is because it's the common language, it's the lingua franca that the federal government understands in its relationship to native tribes and peoples. Again, the spirit of NAGPRA is necessary, because what it's doing then is that it dislocates, that colonial discourse, and allows tribes to actually reclaim, repatriate, and practice, their rights of self-determination, and the networks of, of responsibility that they have with each other, based upon, their tribal histories, cultures, customs, knowledge, traditions, social, political, environmental, social, religious, spiritual, and philosophical means that have always been in practice, since time immemorial, because the tribes were here pre-colonial period. Does this make any sense? It's so dealing with NAGPRA is not a singular mechanistic legal apparatus, is what I'm saying. Is that there's more to it that actually needs to be explored and utilized, framing the arguments for tribal rights, and then, taking possession and invested possession of the term sovereignty, decolonizing it, and using the language of the colonizer to then frame and understand, the recognition, witness, and identity and ideologies that are in practice for and based upon tribal entities and their relationships. That's NAGPRA. Does it make any sense? It's not a complicated point to be making or saying. However, it's not being talked about like that. What we see when we talk about NAGPRA is that we fall victim and coalesce back on the structure of NAGPRA being a legal mandate. It's a law that was passed. And if we start looking at this article, I just dropped a whole bunch of heady stuff on you. So hopefully, you took the notes of all these things, and and where they go. And I'm really glad that that we have this documented, because it's so important to have teased out and discussed, because this is the way to approach NAGPRA itself, making it a living entity rather than just a document status. So, in taking a look at page 3, the context of NAGPRA, and then the authors begin it and talk about the repatriation was taken up by Congress in 1986. And then they talk about where it's actually not the first element, where it comes out of the native cultures collections, circa and following the Antiquities Act of 1906, which is very important and responsible, where then Congress eventually passed. Here it says, on page 3 in the middle, it says, quote, Congress passed NAGPRA in 1990 after, inner quote, intense wrangling and dissension among college professors, archaeologists, museum directors, and native tribes. With the passing of NAGPRA, institutions that received federal monies were ordered to identify what Native American remains and burial and sacred objects were in their collections, find out what tribe they belonged to, and return those items to those tribes. Though repatriation reports are not required under NAGPRA, 2016 statistics showed the number of human remains, associated and unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and objects that are both sacred and patrimonial, which are, inner quote, eligible for repatriation, and have been published according to the Federal Registry. Okay, and then just continues, just to kind of follow this out. It says NAGPRA stipulated that even if native objects had been under museum custody for a century or more, the museum did not have good title because they were either inalienable or communally owned. Okay, and then it goes on and talks about the NAGPRA Review Committee. So just that point, and then I love it how the authors go down and talk about the ethics committee, and the ethics task force, and then who's able to sit on these, and their relationship to native communities and cultures, and then the example that they give of the Kumeyaay is very important, because hey, you know I hang out with and was around a ton of Kumeyaay people. Heck, to put a finer quote on it, one of my uncles who is Kumeyaay, um, when I was learning to bird sing, he brought me out as a Kumeyaay bird singer, before my uncle said, dude, you're Latino, you ain't Kumeyaay, come over here, you gotta learn our songs. So I have a lot of, deep relationship, with Kumeyaay people. And I went to college, on their occupied, territories, and finished my doctoral work there, which is really, interesting. And I just gave you, the location of where I did my doctoral degree. If you actually look up, the Kumeyaay territory, you'll know where I went to college then, for my doctoral work, and spent way too many years, on that campus. But it was fun. It was a good campus, and I had a lot of fun there. Good times, good times. If I can remember most of them. But in any case, what that quote was dropping on you actually articulated all of the points that I'm saying, because I'm exercising and proposing to you. Man, that word, I don't like that word. What I'm presenting to you as a discipline and an action is that the ideology of NAGPRA needs to be put into effect for not just the actual physical means of NAGPRA, but then also for taking it and making it a contextual, grassroots activist, native activist, level and platform upon which native rights of self-determination, recognition, witness, and usurping the colonial term of sovereignty to be used and practiced in a decolonial, structure, mandated, fortified, secured, and implemented by tribal entities. So I'm seeing it in a larger context rather than it being a microscopic, myopic, one, which we talked about last time, because I had to give you all that kind of context and background and everything to the physical natures and properties of what NAGPRA is, and its positions and locations, that are involved with inside of it. The article is going on and developing, these points, and giving you more of a site specific understanding. I'm opening up the package, and dropping the big can of worms on us and saying, hey, look, there's actually a lot more that's involved here than what we're talking about. There's a lot more, that's invested inside of NAGPRA that needs to be discussed, explored, presented, and followed in order for native tribes to actually have, the rights of self-determination, and to, unpackage and to dismantle, the term sovereignty based along the lines of tribal recognition, witness, and network association that was in existence pre-colonial times. So it's taking sovereignty and actually then using it, but re-narrating it, re-articulating it along tribal lines of discourse. That's what I'm saying. My background in talking about things is creating, critical native epistemologies. This is what I do. So for me to be able to take apart and look at sovereignty and look at it as a term that has been colonialized and manufactured and placed upon Native people as a means for which Native tribes have been housing since the 1970s, to be able to put into fair, equitable practice, and to say, look, the way that for it to happen actually took place, and boom, got dropped in its origins in 1906, with the Antiquities Act. Going back and we look at this, 1906 with the Antiquities Act, in 1986, when the whole, Congress took up the issue, an idea of what would be repatriation based upon, the Archaeological Resource and Protections Act, of 1979. So we went from 1906 and 1979 with the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, regarding the remains and existing artifacts in museums and similar institutions, that U.S. Congress took up in the issue of repatriation in 1986. That's when it happened. But it was through, and what the authors, talk about is that it's the era and the history of disrespect, which they actually claim and frame, that comes out of the Great Depression era and the New Deal. I'm gonna drop it on you and say that it actually possessions and points a little bit further with the Indian Relocation Act, the IRA of the 1950s, which then actually follows along the lines of tribal assimilation in the assimilation structures and practices that were put into place, to assimilate native tribes. And it was not until the Power movement got started, the end of 1969, going specifically 68 into 73, by the time that those laws were actually passed, and the federal government changed its relationship with Native people from being that of assimilation to that of self-determination and sovereignty. There it is. And understanding, the tribes have that kind of relationship, and no longer the domestic dependence, but it's a nation to nation relationship that the native tribes have with the United States, and that's the current status and location. So I'm saying that because of all these things and what has happened then subsequently since 1986, 1990, when NAGPRA was passed and updated and mandated, they dropped to you on 2016 is when it happened. It's been reevaluated at the turn of the century. That's in 2000. I believe it even went through another critical review in 2020, right before the shutdown of everything. With what was that little thing that we had to go through? Oh yeah, that pandemic. you know when it was like, things just went on hold, for 2.5, 2 years, while the world tried to figure out what it was that we were going to be doing with it. Was it real, was it not, and on all those issues that are related around that period of time, where it was like, we skipped, a few years in history. um So there's a lot that's involved with NAGPRA that's much more at the helm, ideologically, as a principle, as a standard, and it can be used and put into practice, succinctly, actively, and for the purposes of actually articulating fair, equitable relations, nation to nation relationships with the tribes, to the federal government, not just based upon, artifacts and remains, but also based upon political and social relationships and discourse. Language needs to be repatriated. The arts, the expressive arts, needs to be repatriated. Native politics needs to be repatriated. Native identity needs to be repatriated. All of these things fall under NAGPRA, the way that I'm seeing and looking at it, and contextualizing it, because I review NAGPRA in probably the most different, offbeat, you know left-handed, crazy way than what other people do. And this is why a lot of my colleagues are just like, dude, you are bananas. Will you just leave? Because I'm seeing it, though, from these complex angles and these multifaceted ways, that it requires a paradigm shift in the way that we look at it. But I deal with critical native, epistemologies. I deal with sociological deconstruction along the lines of supporting native, identity from a conscious, pedagogical and epistemological, angle. It's a critical analysis. I'm a critical native theorist. This is what I do. So for me to take the law and to read it and to present it to you in an argumentative style, exploring and using our article to frame the argument, for me, that makes total sense. I call that Tuesday. I mean, that, yeah, sure, no problem. But to look at it and to frame the article and to contextualize it in that way really opens up the idea and the principalities and the understanding of what NAGPRA is to a larger scope understanding relationship that is not just encapsulated inside of a document, but actually makes it a living entity. That's what I'm saying. The article's cool. Keep going. We'll talk about it more next time. So, what do you think? We have fun?